Naomi's husband, Elimelech, died. Then her two sons, Machlon and Chilion, they died, leaving Naomi in dire straits, and her daughters-in-law as widows. Now, the ancient world of the Middle East was a man's world. And a woman without a husband or without sons to care for her or protect her, well, she was extremely vulnerable. Yet Naomi was as concerned with the fate of her two widowed daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, as she was despondent over her own situation. Now, key to taking the book of Ruth in proper perspective is that the book is actually centered on finding a solution for Naomi's problem. Ruth and Orpah were young. They had prospects. So their plight was actually pretty mild and solvable compared to Naomi's. And the quickest and the best solution for these two girls was to stay in their home territory of Moab, even as Naomi set out to return to her home, Bethlehem, Beit-Lechem, in Judah. Now, we've read the entire first chapter of Ruth, but let's reread a small piece of it and examine it point by point. So open your Bibles to the book of Ruth, the first chapter. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it's page 1057. And we're going to read verses 8 through 15. Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Each of you go back to your mother's house. May Adonai show grace to you as you did to those who died and to me. May Adonai grant you security in the home of a new husband." Then she kissed them, but they began weeping aloud. And they said to her, "No, we want to return with you to your people." And Naomi said, "Go back, my daughters. Why do you want to go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb who could become your husbands? Go back, my daughters. Go your way. I'm too old to have a husband. Even if I were to say I still have hope, even if I had a husband tonight and bore sons, would you wait for them until they grew up? Would you refuse to marry just for them? No, my daughters, on your behalf I feel very bitter that the hand of Adonai has gone out against me." And again they wept aloud, and then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. But Ruth stuck with her. And she said, "Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her God. Go back after your sister-in-law." Now, the first words of this passage are an exhortation by Naomi for these two daughters-in-law of hers, with whom there was an obvious loving bond and close relationship, to leave Naomi to her fate, and for them to return home to their Moabite mothers so that they could be comforted, they could be cared for in their childhood homes until that day came that the Lord provided new husbands for them. Now, part of this exhortation included a blessing by Naomi that the God of Israel would show these young widows favor. In fact, the blessings specifically calls out Yehoveh's name. Now, understand that the invocation of Yehoveh is interesting in and of itself, because the three women are still at this time in the land of Moab, a place that, although foreign for Naomi, a Jewish woman, it was native for Orpah and for Ruth. See, it was the general mindset of people in that era and culture to see the land attached to the national god or gods. In other words, a god usually only had a sphere of influence that extended no further than the territory or the nation where he or she was established as that local deity. Now, I want to elaborate on that thought just a tad more, because it's going to help us to understand so many other passages in the Bible, what a huge effect the world and protocol of the gods had upon people's decisions. See, Chemosh, that was the chief deity over the land of Moab. Chemosh. Ruth and Orpah were born. They were raised with the understanding that Chemosh held all divine authority over what happened in Moab. So any vow that was made within his territory had to invoke his name and his authority, or it was ineffective. Maybe it was even invalid. But the situation was not all that cut and dried. During the time frame of the book of Ruth, Moab was not a sovereign nation. Moab had been conquered just a few decades earlier by Israel. And the Israelite tribes of Reuben and Gad now settled much of the land of Moab. However, as with all the territories conquered on the east side of the Jordan River, those occupied by the 12 tribes, this is where the former nation of Moab lay, and it looked similar to a pock-marked landscape of the moon. In other words, from a distance, the surface of the moon looks smooth and homogeneous. But up close, it actually consists of hundreds of separate craters, slightly separated from one another, and at other times, a little bit overlapping. So like the lunar landscape, the Israelite tribal territories that were east of the Dead Sea consisted of pockets of Moabites living next to pockets of Israelites. And at times, they overlapped and they intermingled. That meant that there was ambiguity over which God ruled where. The usual solution was just worship them all, or at least show them all respect. So we should not take it that because the Hebrew, Naomi, invoked the God of Israel in her blessing, that she didn't believe that Chemosh existed. Or should we think that the Moabites, Ruth and Orpah, had given up on Chemosh, and as a result of marrying Jewish men, they worshipped only Yehoveh? Bowing down to or invoking the name of different gods at different times, according to different situations, and exactly where you were standing at the time, well, that was usual and normal for the ancient mind, and that generally included the Hebrews. Well, after blessing her daughters-in-law, they both still insisted on following Naomi back to Judah. So Naomi introduced an argument to dissuade them. And the argument essentially focused on the impossibility of levirate marriage occurring in that situation. Let's kind of reacquaint ourselves with the concept of levirate marriage. Turn your Bibles to Deuteronomy chapter 25. Deuteronomy chapter 25. We're going to look at verses 5 through 10. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, we're going to be on page 224. 224. This is Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 10. Pay attention to this. If brothers live together and one of them dies childless, his widow is not to marry someone unrelated to him. her husband's brother is to go to her and perform the duty of a brother-in-law by marrying her. The first child she bears will succeed to the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be eliminated from Israel. If the man does not wish to marry his brother's widow, then his brother's widow is to go up to the gate to the leaders and say, "My brother-in-law refuses to raise up for his brother a name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother for me. The leaders of his town are to summon him and to speak to him. And if on appearing before them he continues to say, 'I don't want to marry her,' then the brother's widow is to approach him in the presence of the leaders, pull his sandal off of his foot, spit in his face, and say, 'This is what is done to the man who refuses to build up his brother's family.' From that time on, his family is to be known in Israel as the family of the man who had his sandal pulled off." To us, that's kind of tickles us a little bit. But this is very serious business. Very serious business. So the idea is that a surviving biological brother, or perhaps a very close relative, of a man who has died is to marry his brother's widow and impregnate her, assuming this woman has not already had sons. And the intent is that the first son that she produces with her new husband will be considered the offspring of the deceased husband. So the deceased's family line then will continue, and several other vital issues will be resolved, including giving this widow a son to care for her in her old age, a fulfillment of her duty as a woman for bringing new life into the world, seen as the ultimate and required duty, by the way, of a woman, else she was practically no woman at all, allowing the spiritual essence and character of her former husband, the deceased man, to live on in his son, otherwise that essence would terminate, and providing for the land of the deceased man to be passed along to someone, a son, who was a member of his own clan, his own tribe, thus fulfilling the requirements of the law of Moses. It's a complicated deal. The overall concept of levirate marriage was not necessarily a Hebrew invention. However, it was practiced, and the reason it was practiced by the Israelites was indeed uniquely Hebrew. In fact, the custom of levirate marriage was so predominant in Middle Eastern society and also loosely practiced among the early Hebrews that we see an example of it occurring centuries before God pronounced it as Torah law, giving it to Moses on Mount Sinai. Back in Genesis 38:8, we read, "Judah said to Onan, 'Go and sleep with your brother's wife, perform the duty of a husband's brother to her, and preserve your brother's line of descent.'" That kind of sums up the main reason for this. Now, despite the similarity, by the way, between the term levirate and the name of the priestly tribe, Levi, those two terms are not related. Okay, levirate is actually a Gentile term, taken from the Latin word lever, meaning husband's brother. So we're not even going to find that word in the Bible. Well, now with that understanding in your minds of the nature of levirate marriage, we can now better understand what Naomi had in her mind and in her argument for Ruth and Orpah to go home to their mothers. So in verse 11, Naomi asks rhetorically, "Do I still have sons in my womb who could become your husbands?" In other words, Is the reason for the insistence of these two girls that they were going to stick with Naomi coming from their naive belief that the next logical step for them is levirate marriage since they were childless? Of course, the question is absurd since Naomi has no other sons. In other words, these deceased men had no brothers. And she's far past childbearing years. So to emphasize just how silly it would be for these two girls to harbor such thoughts, she doesn't even actually use the term womb like we usually find it translated. Rather, she says, do I still have sons in my meh? That is, do I still have sons in my insides? Now, continuing to show Orpah and Ruth the futility of pursuing the tradition of levirate marriage, Naomi continues with offering the intentionally absurd argument that even though she is too old to have a husband now, suppose by miracle she got one. Then in a bigger miracle, even challenging the one of Abraham's wife Sarah, she becomes pregnant in her old age. Would those two girls be willing to wait until that occurred and then wait even longer for the sons to be born and then grow up to a marriageable age so that they could marry the two widows and then give them children? So that's the essence of this whole argument that Naomi's been making to her two daughters-in-law. Understand, it was not unusual for a widow to wait for the younger brother, an already born one, of course, all right, a younger brother of her deceased husband, a brother that was still a young child, to grow up and marry her and get her pregnant, hopefully with a son. However, the situation in this particular case was in a kind of a gray area. I mean, after all, Naomi herself was a widow. So whoever might marry Naomi and father Naomi's babies would be a different father than the father of Naomi's deceased sons. So at best, Naomi's hypothetical children would be only half-brothers of these deceased husbands, and whether that even qualified as proper levirate marriage is debatable. So the possibility of employing levirate marriage to solve these two girls' problem is just out of the question, if not downright irrational. It's the bottom line. Therefore, in verse 13, Naomi says, "No, my daughters, on your behalf, I feel very bitter that the hand of Adonai has gone out against me." And her argument finally hit home, and reality broke through, and all the emotion just caused them to all start weeping together profusely. Now, Orpah knew what she must do, and so she kissed Naomi goodbye. As I mentioned last week, in this era, a kiss was not so much a symbol of affection, rather it literally meant either hello or goodbye. So the Hebrew does not say that Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. Rather, it merely says Orpah kissed her mother-in-law. The goodbyes was to be understood as the reason for the kiss. We also get the first hint in this passage of Naomi's attitude about her own condition. She is bitter. And she feels that God intentionally caused her bitterness. And a few verses from now, this thought is picked up upon. And we're going to talk about it a little more because it is a challenging notion for modern Christians for sure. Now, a hint of another kind is also presented to us, and it goes back to what I told you early on. This story that forms the book of Ruth is actually all about Naomi. It's all about her plight as an aged, childless widow. In the same statement where she answered her own rhetorical question with an emphatic "No, my daughters," about whether the girls should wait and hope that Naomi finds a husband, miraculously has a couple of boy children who'd grow up and marry them, she says she feels very bitter that the hand of God has gone out against her. The hint is this, that it is even more of a disadvantage and a more serious problem for her that there is no reasonable chance for levirate marriage for these daughters-in-law than it is for them, because these girls have options. These girls can go home to be cared for by their families and in time find new husbands. But for Naomi, the only real hope she has is for some kind of levirate marriage to happen for these two girls, because that would give her sons, technically grandsons, but you have to remember in this era, there just really wasn't much difference between children and grandchildren. So now she'd have somebody to care for her. See, it wouldn't have been at all out of the realm of possibility for the girls to marry one of Elimelech's brothers. In other words, one of their uncles. Assuming the deceased Elimelech had brothers. Remember who Elimelech was? Right? That was Naomi's husband, now dead. And if they did, and if they produced sons, then in the ancient Middle Eastern way of thinking, these sons would become grandchildren of Naomi's and as obligated to care for her as they would be for their own parents. Now, this might sound very convoluted and complicated to us, but this formula and this custom was well understood. It was normal for the society of that era. So the thing is that Naomi was very bitter that all these circumstances lined up to conspire against her having any hope whatsoever of a decent life in her old age. So Orpah turns and tearfully leaves to go home to Mama, back in her Moabite hometown. Now, did Orpah do something wrong or selfish or evil in leaving Naomi and going back? Not at all. Not at all. It would be unfair and untrue to say that she was disloyal or uncaring or had committed some kind of a sin. Not only did she do what Naomi sincerely insisted she do, she did what was perfectly reasonable in response to her situation. Orpah did not make a bad choice, but from the vantage point of history, she could have made a better one. She could have followed Naomi and trusted in a God that she knew very little about and attached herself to people she knew about even less. Instead, she went home to her people, the Moabites. Her people worshipped Chemosh. So essentially, she unknowingly put her fate into the hands of a false god. Now, I don't want to go too far in drawing a comparison. But Orpah's decision affords us a good picture of how it is that people can walk right up to the brink of accepting the redemption of the God of Israel and his son Yeshua and not take that final step because there seems just maybe to be another road. And it is the natural, even logical, if not easier road. It's not necessarily an inherently evil road. It just doesn't lead to the true God and his plan for us. See, there's an interesting parallel to this narrative about Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth in the New Testament in the book of Matthew. Matthew 8:19. A Torah teacher approached and said to him, Rabbi, I will follow you wherever you go. And Yeshua said to him, well, the foxes have holes, the birds flying about have nests, but the Son of Man has no home of his own. Another of the Talmudim, the disciples, said to him, Sir, first let me go and bury my father. But Yeshua replied, Follow me and let the dead bury their dead. Now, we don't know for certain what choices these two men made when Yeshua told them what they must do and how uncertain life would be for them in following him. But the point is that this little episode is so reflective of the Naomi story. The men, like Ruth and Orpah, insist on following this extremely godly man, Yeshua, who is God, but he warns them off. And he says he really has no good prospects of comfort and plenty ahead of him that he could share with them. The one makes a statement that he will follow Yeshua right then and there, no matter. Now the other one says, well, he'd like to follow Jesus, but really he needs to return home for a while before he does. Now, with no other information given, it's probably reasonable to suspect that the first one did go with Yeshua, like Ruth did eventually go with Naomi, but the second one returned home to bury his father. That's kind of like Orpah's route. They would not have done an evil thing, not to follow Messiah as part of his team, if you would. They would not have done any wrong thing at all. But the better thing would have been to have dropped everything and gone with him. And by the way, while we tend to spiritualize this event and make it that the choice of following Yeshua was essentially a choice between salvation and no salvation, that's not what's stated. Rather, it was whether they would leave their current life behind and travel with him and serve with him as itinerant disciples. There is no reason to believe that they did not trust Yeshua as Messiah. It was their level of commitment. This is the issue. And then translating that commitment to an action. That's the issue. I hope you see that. And frankly, everyone listening to this needs to ask him or herself if they are willing to commit to a whole new path in their lives that just might not lead them where they think they want to go, or that even improves their earthly lot. Orpah was like the man who felt he needed to go home to bury his father. Ruth was like the other man who just said unconditionally, I'll follow you wherever you go. And so this leads us right into one of the most eloquent, spiritually meaningful, yet elegantly simple series of statements we're ever likely to find in the Bible. After Orpah kisses Naomi goodbye, Naomi tries one last time to get Ruth to follow suit and says, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people, to her God. You go back after your sister-in-law. Ruth will have none of it. And she settles the matter once and for all. Let's read together Ruth 1, 15 through 18. Ruth 1, 15 through 18. She said, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her God. Go back after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, don't press me to leave you and stop following you. For wherever you go, I'll go. Wherever you stay, I'll stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I'll die. There I'll be buried. May Adonai bring terrible curses upon me, and worse ones as well, if anything but death separates you and me. When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. Ruth, in that short few verses, makes 6 promises to Naomi, and then she seals them with a vow. First is that wherever Naomi goes, Ruth will go. Second is that wherever Ruth lives, she'll stay. Third, Naomi's people will become Ruth's people. Fourth, Naomi's God will become Ruth's God. Fifth, where Naomi dies, Ruth will die. And finally, sixth, wherever Naomi chooses to be buried, Ruth desires to be buried alongside her. Ruth essentially made a covenant with Naomi and then bound it with the oath, may Yehoveh bring terrible curses upon me and worse ones as well if anything but death separates you and me. I know the complete Jewish Bible says, may Adonai bring terrible curses, and many other translations will say, may the Lord bring terrible curses, but the original Hebrew very necessarily invokes God's formal name, Yehoveh, YHWH. This is significant because Ruth has sworn by who? The God of the Hebrews, not the God of the Moabites. That's the God of her native nationality. This shows in whom Ruth truly believed, in whom her allegiance was given, but it also shows whom she rejected, Chemosh. The phrase, may Yehoveh bring terrible curses on me and more, is a rather standard formula, invoking the punishment of God should the promises be broken, and we're going to find it used 7 times in the books of Samuel and Kings. Now, while on the surface, and without doubt as Ruth meant it and Naomi understood it, Ruth was committing both her social life to the people of Israel and her religious life to the God of Israel. But there is yet something deeper happening here. Using modern terms, Ruth converted. She left paganism, the way we would think about it, to become an Israelite. And yet, as we move through this short story, there's a certain mystery to it all. An important element of the narrative is how a Gentile became an Israelite, and just what all that entailed. What fascinates me is that we have here a marvelous picture of how to this day a person forsakes everything to become part of Israel. It is symbolic of every Gentile who has ever come to faith through Israel's God. At least one of the keys to understanding this mystery is that Orpah went back, we're told, to her people and what else? To her God. While Ruth went forward to Naomi's people and to Naomi's God. A people and their God are connected, whether we like it or not, whether we'll admit it or not. Ruth has shown us the way. But unfortunately, the largest bulk of the church has chosen to stick to or go back to its Moabitish ways. Gentile Christians want the salvation and the nearness of the God of Israel. They just don't want any part of Israel. Of the 6 commitments made by the Gentile, Ruth, to the Jew, Naomi, the modern church agrees with just one. Your God will be my God. But the church also says to Israel and to the Jewish people, although I want your God, I will not go where you go. I will not stay where you stay. You will not be my people. I will not die where you will die. I will not be buried where you are buried. How might this story of Ruth have worked out had she adopted the modern Christian doctrine of complete separation from, even this thought of replacing the Jews as God's chosen people? Because indeed, we, brothers and sisters, we are faced with 2 entirely opposing, and I'm sorry, irreconcilable theologies here. When we compare the one here in the first chapter of Ruth with the most prevalent contemporary church doctrine. One theology says that Gentiles can have the God of Israel for our own outside of Israel's covenants, outside of God's people, and made under our own Gentile terms. The other theology says that a people and their God are inseparable. You cannot have one without the other. The theology of Ruth says that to submit to the God of Israel means to cleave to the people of Israel. It means our fates become bound together beginning in a historic past and proceeding to a historic and prophetic future. When Ruth came to Israel with Naomi, she willingly left her Gentile ways behind and went forward, eyes open, into a new reality of which she had little practical knowledge. The church, however, has brought its Gentile ways along with us, shows no interest in knowing or learning the ways of God's people, and has even taken the extreme position that as Gentiles, we are more God's people than are Moses' Israelites. In fact, a major portion of the modern church sides with and identifies with Israel's enemies. Can you imagine Ruth following Naomi into Beit-Lechem, insisting she wants Israel's God, and then coming with the attitude that her Moabite ways are superior to the ways of God's set-apart people as given through Moses? And in fact, she has replaced them in God's eyes. That's what we're talking about here. My friends, this is the predominant position of a modern church towards Israel and the Jewish people, and it's nothing less than a catastrophe. It falls to believers like you and me to do what we can do to right the wrongs, to resist the false doctrines of too many, not all, but way too many Christian denominations, and to restore the entire Word of God to its rightful place within Christianity. To bring the good news of the Jewish Messiah to his Jewish brethren. See, it falls upon us to comfort his people, to join them in spirit, to ask them, frankly, for forgiveness of our treatment of them, I want to conclude this thought with one final statement. I've spoken to you on a couple of occasions about the very different, although closely connected, matter of faith versus faithfulness. Of the 6 commitments that Ruth made to Naomi, only one was about faith. The other 5 were about faithfulness. Ruth declaring that your God will be my God is a declaration of faith. But the other 5 commitments are the expression of that faith. What it means to adopt that faith. And the expression of faith in deed and in action is called faithfulness. We have millions of believers today and over the centuries who had faith, but far fewer who lived lives of faithfulness. Now, verse 18 shows that the elderly widow Naomi simply could no longer deflect such a stunningly impassioned covenant that Ruth unilaterally made with her. And how unusual that must have been for those times and in that culture. In a patriarchal society, here we have a woman choosing to follow another woman. When in an era where all hope that a woman has for sustenance and family and prosperity and protection and comfort and fulfillment, well, this all rested on males. Here we have a God-inspired story of a woman who preferred to give up such hope in favor of helping an old woman who had no such hope available for her. So together they journeyed back to Naomi's home in Beit-Lechem in Judah. It was a very arduous journey, about 75 miles. And one must wonder how Naomi could have survived it without Ruth. I mean, the plateaus of Moab, where they left from, were at an elevation of about 3,500 feet. The hills leading up to Beit-Lechem over 2,500 feet. And after descending rugged trails, crossing the Jordan River at probably the best and most known fording spot, which was near Jericho at that time, the next phase of their trek would have been the worst. Anyone who has been to Israel will remember the buses and trucks slowly crawling up that long, winding grade that takes one from Jericho, which is more than 800 feet below sea level, up to the hills of Jerusalem and Bethlehem. There are few springs, there's no food, it's mostly desert conditions along the way, but somehow, by God's grace, they made it. When the two arrived in Beit-Lechem, caused a rather major stir. So let's read a couple more verses. Ruth 1, we're going to start at verse 19 and read to the end. So the two of them went on until they came to Beit-Lechem. And when they arrived in Beit-Lechem, the whole city was stirred with excitement over them. And the woman asked, "Can this be Naomi? Don't call me Naomi." She answered them, "Call me Marah," which means bitter, because Shaddai has made my life very bitter. I went out full, and Adonai has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? Adonai has testified against me. Shaddai has afflicted me. This is how Naomi returned, with Ruth, the woman from Moab, her daughter-in-law, accompanying her from the plains of Moab. They arrived in Beit-Lechem at the beginning of the barley harvest. That the whole city or town was stirred with excitement over the arrival of Naomi. As a figure of speech, it merely means that a great portion of it was, not 100% of it. But even more, the verb used to refer to the reaction of the whole city, which is hum in Hebrew, which means kind of like an excited uproar, is conjugated in the feminine plural. In other words, it was the women of the city who noticed Naomi and approached her, not so much the men. Now remember, this is a female-oriented story. And the women came up to her saying, "Can this be Naomi?" Now this is just a rhetorical question. They knew who it was. They knew it was Naomi. It's just an expression of surprise. And further, it's not that they actually asked this of Naomi. I mean, they didn't ask her to confirm her identity. It was just more the tone of their conversation among one another as they saw her approach, and they couldn't hardly believe their eyes. But in response to this rather joyful astonishment by the women of Bethlehem towards her, people who probably never expected to see her again, by the way, Naomi tells them not to call her Naomi any longer, but rather to call her Mara. Now, recalling that her name Naomi means pleasant, she tells them not to refer to her character or countenance as pleasant any longer, because now she's Mara, she's bitter. What is more surprising is what the stated cause of her bitterness is. It's God. Now, this is where things can get a little bit dicey for Christians. Because Naomi makes it clear that her understanding is that the God of Israel, with full divine intention, brought about her intractable condition of poverty and hopelessness. Very interestingly, Naomi calls God Shaddai in this instance, an epithet for God we haven't read in a long time. It is confidently thought now that Shaddai means mountain. And so the earliest name or title or epithet used for God in the Bible of El Shaddai literally meant God of the mountain, or even more technically, chief or highest God of the mountain. Shaddai was undoubtedly just a contraction of El Shaddai that was used in certain circumstances by some in Ruth's era, or maybe in the era of the author of the book of Ruth. I don't know which. The thing is that often in the English language, I think we'd all agree, the sum of the words doesn't necessarily mean what they literally say when you use them as an expression. For instance, don't let the cat out of the bag. Has nothing to do with cats or bags. Wow, that's very cool. It's not referring to the temperature. Don't cry over spilt milk. Doesn't mean to avoid tears if you knock over the milk carton. Shaddai literally meant mountain. But because the chief deity, wherever a person might be, always occupied the highest spot on the highest mountain, to say that Shaddai caused Naomi's trouble was much like saying the irresistible God, the most powerful of all the gods, caused it. So there was no court of appeals. Naomi says that Shaddai made her life bitter. She went out, she left Beit-Lechem full, but Yehoveh brought her back empty. That is, she switches from the very dramatic Shaddai to using God's formal name. And she says that Yehoveh has testified against her, and then again switches back and says Shaddai has afflicted her. It's merely a way to get across the fact that she was powerless before the God of the cosmos and that there is no stopping the curse of emptiness that she bears once Yehovah has decided to place it upon her. But here's where we deal with some more theology. Modern Christians tend to be rather schizophrenic over how we see the Lord dealing with our personal lives. On the one hand, we say that God controls every aspect of our existence. But when something bad happens, we blame the devil. We say that with the advent of Christ, that the Lord only afflicts his people with mercy and with loving kindness, so the bad things in our lives are either natural repercussions or they're demonic or they're human in source. That is not the theology of the Older Testament. And I would say with confidence, that is not the theology of Yeshua either. Rather, it is a doctrine of men who wish only to recognize God's attributes as the most pleasant ones for us. Naomi and the characters of the Bible had no such delusions. How often I have heard the statement from the mouths of pastors, "The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away." But they apparently don't mean it. And they don't believe it. Because if something bad happens as the result of, say, a sin, the standard statement is that God doesn't punish those who are his. The Lord gives and takes away is really all Naomi's stating. That's exactly what she's stating. The Lord gave to her, sent her out full, and then the Lord took it back, brought her back empty. But she says it with no hypocrisy, and she understands that if God really does control all, like we say he does, then whether she has plenty or she has nothing, it's all from his hand. You see, the Old Testament in particular expresses what I would call a theology of complaint. As a person under God's covenants, there was no such thing as luck, no such thing as happenstance. Everything is under God's purview and providence. Many times a biblical character would have terrible things happen to them, and thus they fully assigned it to Yehoveh. And often they complained to one another. They complained directly to God about it. In general, the Lord doesn't seem to see much this kind of direct complaint as a wrong thing to do. That said, it's one thing to complain about your situation and the deep pain you're in to him, and that you don't really understand it. And especially that you really don't like it one bit. But it's quite another to confront God and tell him he's wrong. He's erred. This shouldn't be happening to me. He has no right to do what he's doing. Naomi, of course, was expressing the former viewpoint, so was doing nothing wrong. She didn't have a bad attitude. She wasn't being disobedient or unfaithful to Yehovah. She was but acknowledging that the source of her troubles was God's decision. And she was suffering under his hand for whatever his reasons were. She was in no way challenging God's motives or authority to do it. Frankly, I find that kind of refreshing. Theologically, by the way, it's dead on. Just as we cannot accept God without accepting his people, neither can we accept the kind part of God without acknowledging the severe part as well. we find this same concept spoken to believers through Paul when using the olive tree metaphor to explain Gentile believers' relationship to Israel and to Israel's Messiah. He issues a warning. In Romans 11:22, he says this: so take a good look at God's kindness and his severity. On the one hand, severity towards those who fell off, but on the other hand, God's kindness towards you, provided you maintain yourself in that kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. The first chapter concludes with tying up the loose ends, that indeed Ruth was with Naomi when she arrived at Bethlehem, and that they arrived at the same time, or rather, they arrived at around the time of the barley harvest, which would have been around April by our calendars. But it also puts it at about the time of the biblical feast of Shavuot, Christian Pentecost. And this is at the heart of why the book of Ruth is read today in synagogues as a tradition throughout the world on the occasion of Shavuot. Okay, we'll begin chapter 2 next week.
Help support God's people by purchasing items made by them, merchandise with a meaning, products with a purpose. HolyLandMarketplace.com. For more teachings, visit, support, or donate at TorahClass.com. Join with us in worship and enjoy God's Word at Seed of Abraham Fellowship.